apologize for those glitches there at the beginning. Well, Scott, I have a few questions for you. Some that I'm actually very interested in knowing the answer to myself. How would you assess and compare the personalities of Washington and Monroe? How were they similar? How were they different?
I think to the degree that you can judge from our vantage point, and it has to be from the evidence, what they themselves might have said, what others said about them, and then just apply a little Kentucky windage to it. It was evident that they were both men who cared very much about how they were perceived within the world in which they lived and operated. They had very strong senses of personal honor, of their reputation, and each had a temper, which they generally sought to keep in check. But when it revealed itself in either man, it was remarkable because it could be pretty vehement. And yet, I think realizing the extent of their tempers, they sought very hard to control it. I think both Washington and Monroe essentially saw themselves as gentlemen farmers, or aspiring to that. Washington had considerably better success at it, even though he had challenges. Started from a better place too, in terms of family resources and everything. But in both cases, whatever happened in their careers, whether it be in war or in peace and politics, they both expressed this longing to get back, in Washington's case, to his vine and fig tree. And the call of duty kept taking them away from that at one point or another. And long after Washington was dead, it still kept happening to Monroe. He'd take on another diplomatic posting or accept an office. And it was really a struggle for him to ever get the sort of farm situation that he thought would have been ideal. He had three of them that he lived on at various times, and really Oak Hill, his last home, was the one that came closest to what he wanted. So in those respects, I think they shared a great love of the identification of being part of the gentry of the soil. Each in his own way, too, obviously was very strongly devoted to the American Republic. They saw it through somewhat different lenses in terms of not only our domestic politics, but our foreign relations. But I think at heart, there was more similar in what they wanted for the country, what they wanted to achieve, than different. But the differences kept them apart into, I think, their mutual regret. They were never able to bridge them.
Well, I think this is an interesting question. As we know that political disagreements in this era sometimes led to duels. Is there any evidence that the conflict between these two might have ever come to such a result?
I have not found it. And I'd kind of wondered that too. You certainly writing on congressional violence, and Joanne Freeman, who spoke at Great Lives last year, who we've had at the James Monroe Museum, has certainly made a career of talking about affairs of honor and the degree to which political differences could evolve into violent confrontations. It didn't get that far with Washington and Monroe between them, as far as I can tell. Monroe did compose a letter to Washington that he never sent, and it's probably best that he didn't, because it was the most blunt and scathing and very personal attack on Washington as having been one of the worst things that ever happened to the country. One of the greatest dangers to the American Republic, he felt, was Washington and his administration. That's an amazing thing for anyone to have said about Washington. For Monroe to have said it, it might have been just too much, but he didn't send the letter. Ironically, though, in all the Donnybrook that followed his French mission and coming back in disgrace and humiliation, one person who did get under his skin was John Adams, the vice president, who was very openly critical of Monroe and sort of characterized him as a whining, washed-up politician. And Monroe contemplated the possibility of challenging Adams to a duel. Again, just sort of personal consultation with friends. Didn't act on it, partly because of Adams' age and maybe because he was president of the United States.
Yes, that too.
And they later made up. So that turned out good in the long run. But he he was thinking about it in the context of this, just not with Washington.
Yeah. Well, we have a number of questions, so we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. One member of the audience said, did Monroe have any relationships with Washington's family while in Fredericksburg?
That is something that it does not seem that I have seen that there's any real cross-pollination going on there, that we've got a lot of documentation to do. There's a lot of correspondence. Monroe was only in Fredericksburg for a few years as far as being resident here. And Washington's visits, I think, were periodic, certainly for a time to see his mother. But they may have swung in some of the same circles at an event, but there's nothing that was heavily documented that they found time to socialize, at least not that we've seen.
Okay, on a somewhat different note, a specific question, did Washington comment at all on John Jay's treaty with England?
Well, I mean, his commentary, I mean, he was his
emissary.
Yeah, I mean, Washington obviously had a strong emotional tie to France through Lafayette. He understood that the French intervention had made the difference in our winning the revolution. It really did. But he perceived very early on, and he would follow this through his administration and through his final message, which was 1796, by the way, not 97. So sorry about that. Yeah. That the relationship with England was simply going to be more important from his vantage point to the future of the American Republic, especially in those early years, and that we had to stay out of the wars between France and England that were ongoing, and that we had to cultivate that relationship which was most likely to be to the nation's benefit. And so the Jay Treaty was not ideal. It didn't address some of the fundamental things that we wanted out of it, but it was accepted for being the best to be gotten at that time, even though it was going to provoke France, as Monroe was warning.
Okay, let me just read this pretty much as the question was phrased. Ron Journal's book notes that Monroe had a hand in blackmailing Hamilton. Given Washington's esteem for Hamilton, what do you think of Monroe's actions, or did he stay quiet?
Well, to say that Monroe had a hand in blackmailing Hamilton is an interpretation of the facts as we are able to put them together. And I'll try not to go too long with this. When word came to the Senate and to the House of Representatives that Alexander Hamilton might have been doing something improper in office and there were some malfeasance, a congressional committee was dispatched to go call on him. And it was a couple of representatives, and it was Monroe as a senator. And they confronted him with some documents that we have some reason to think maybe you've been doing improper things in office. And that's when Hamilton came back with other documentation saying, no, I'm an honest official, but I've been bribed by the husband of the woman I'm having an affair with, the Mariah Reynolds affair. Yeah. And he laid all this out before them. And it was like, oh, okay, none of our business. And they all said, this is clearly not anything we need to be worried about. But they took the documentation that Hamilton provided. Several years later, it ends up being published, probably through the efforts of James Callender, possibly with Jefferson's encouragement to harm Hamilton. Whether or not Monroe actively encouraged that, it's not entirely clear. What is clear is that Hamilton thought Monroe had done it. He talked to everybody in that congressional group, and they all said, no, we didn't. Monroe's reaction was more like, well, why would you ask me if I leaked it? Why would you think I would have? He came a little just up to saying, no, I didn't, but not quite far enough. And so a correspondence evolved between them that gradually ratcheted up closer and closer to a duel. Neither of them really wanting it. This is why, or during the period, by the way, when Monroe is writing his defense of his French mission, and so in his letters to Hamilton, talking about duel arrangements, he's also mentioning, well, we got to wait a few months so I can get this draft finished and get it to the publisher, and then I need to talk with my wife about arrangements. It's all very kind of matter of fact. Ultimately, though, they reach looking for a way out honorably, and a person that became a go-between for a while with them, ironically, is Aaron Burr. who is helping diffuse the Monroe-Hamilton duel situation a few years before his own duel situation with Hamilton. And so ultimately each sort of acknowledged, but I should say that when they first started talking about this and they had a face-to-face meeting, it got so hot that Hamilton basically said Monroe was a liar and said he would meet him as a gentleman. And Monroe jumped up and said, "I'm ready, get your pistols," which was jumping the game a few moves ahead, and their seconds kind of backed him off of it. So again, this really hot temper that could come when he felt his honor was at stake, the Federalist Republican knife fight that's going on. In that case, it did come close to being a duel.
Scott, there's one aspect of this, these two men that you didn't discuss, and you obviously cannot cover everything in brief space of time, but that of slavery was crucial to the personal economy of both, and to some extent figured into their official actions. Could you comment on the role of slavery in the, well, the personal, but certainly the political lives of these two individuals?
Sure. And as you sort of allude, it's not something that I chose to focus on in this particular presentation. You could probably do a presentation on that subject entirely by itself.
Right.
And, maybe we will. It didn't really lie at the heart of the one-on-one relationship between the two of them in a way that I really thought I could work in any meaningful way. It just wasn't a point of contention between them. It wasn't a factor in the political discourse, certainly during Washington's life, to the degree that would be later, even later in Monroe's own life. Certainly not at the level that slavery would be in the political discussion of the mid-19th century. So in that respect, it wasn't the kind of flashpoint that it would be later on, and certainly not between Washington and Monroe. But yes, it was definitely the factor that made the difference in their personal situations. I mean, both had been raised in slaveholding society. They were from families who had owned slaves for generations. Each bought and sold individuals during the course of their life. And so, although each in their writings did indicate, sometimes fairly strongly, that they saw the institution as something to be gotten rid of eventually, neither of them took steps, certainly in their own personal situation in their lifetime, to do anything about ending slavery or stopping to be practitioners of it. I don't think that in their time they were perceived as particularly cruel or bad masters, but you got to be very careful using that kind of a characterization. Right. Let's say in their time. And yet Ona Judge ran away from Washington and was later able to talk about it quite successfully as having never been caught. Monroe was selling enslaved African Americans south to Florida, and a couple ran away from his Highland farm rather than have that happen. And there's a whole amount of research that's gone on in recent years to try and look at the connections of those families in Virginia and Florida. So there's a lot we're still learning, particularly about Monroe's relationship personally to slavery. And in Washington's, there's been a great deal of study of it, but it wasn't a thing between them. On the official side, again, not a lot of direct interaction. Washington signed the first Fugitive Slave Act. There was some, commentary within his administration regarding it. In Monroe's case, he was a supporter of the American Colonization Society, which was going to take freed African Americans and send them back to Africa, which in itself was an odd concept.
Monrovia, right?
Monrovia, the capital of what is now Liberia, was the colony established by the American Colonization Society. And then when he was governor of Virginia, Gabriel's uprising, which was attempted, which included kidnapping him as one of the goals of that. That was put down, number of executions. He stopped some of them, but others continued. And then the Missouri Compromise, probably the last big milestone of the subject that's relative to his presidency, kind of showing the horizon of what was going to be coming with the
Yeah.
issue.
Right.
So again, there's stuff there to have probably a nice talk just on that subject sometime.
Oh yeah. Oh
Not
yeah.
this one.
Well, Scott, a few brief ones here in conclusion. Some not yes or no answers, but some just inquiries that are fairly specific. You might want to comment on. This one says, is it accurate that Monroe's election to governor may have indirectly contributed to Washington's death?
Well, that's kind of that's the suggestion of the whole start of the talk, and there's sort of an apocryphal sense that he came in and was, as we say, he was so upset by the newspaper account of Monroe being elected. It certainly didn't do him any good. I don't know that it necessarily pushed him over the edge. He had an increasing throat infection. It's not like he died of apoplexy. If he were in an agitated state, I suppose a doctor would tell you that that's not good if you're an old man who's suffering from a serious illness. But clearly, in the midst of everything else he was dealing with at that moment, he felt enough asperity, in the words of his secretary, to comment on it. I think it's probably a stretch to say that it contributed to his death, but it didn't make things any better.
Yeah.
Annoyed.
Yeah. Look, a couple of quick ones. This is an interesting question. What is the most underhanded thing Monroe ever did?
The most underhanded thing Monroe ever did. Wow. I know what Alexander Hamilton would say to that. And his wife, by the way, late in his life, James Monroe visited Eliza Hamilton in an attempt, I guess, to try and assuage his own conscience or to make some amends. And he went to see her, saying, to the effect, there's so few of us left from those times, and we have to look back on all that happened. And she basically told him to go pound sand, that she didn't care how long it had been, really, that she felt that he had harmed her husband greatly, and she was in no mood to forgive him, words to that effect. So I think that, the Hamilton family would have judged Monroe's role, whatever it was in that Maria Reynolds situation, to be the most underhanded. I think that the advocacy for the American Colonization Society was in itself a concept that was not only flawed in the idea of African Americans not necessarily wanting to go to Africa, but it was very targeted at freed African Americans. It was not a wholesale effort to say, let's go free a bunch of people and send them to Africa.
No, in fact, it was largely, I think I'm right in saying it was largely an effort to strengthen slavery, really, by getting rid of the free blacks. Am I right?
Exactly, right. And to take away an element that might be difficult in managing this enslaved population. Yeah, so I don't think there's a lot of nobility in that, even though it kept coming up even into Lincoln's time as a possible solution. Right. So,
a couple more quick ones, Scott. We're almost out of time. Was there any interaction between the wives of the two men?
And I'm seeing a whole lot of other names in that question too. Yes. I don't believe so, partly because of just the circumstances of where they were living. There may have been early on when Monroe was in the Senate and Washington is president, and they're all together there for a brief period before then Monroe was sent over to France and his wife accompanied him. And even, during the Revolution, they're all, Monroe and Washington are at Valley Forge. Martha is there, but he's not married yet. So I don't believe there was any I don't remember any evidence of there being a lot of contact between them. So, no.
Maybe almost to bring this to an end, I'm looking to see if we have, let's see, other questions, try to get a couple more in.
I want to hear about the possibility of a James Monroe president.
Yeah, you see, what the audience doesn't realize is you're seeing these questions as I'm seeing them, yeah. Right? But they don't see them. I think I'm right about that. The technology is a little bit beyond me, but in any case, yes, there is a question about any possibility for a Monroe Presidential Library.
Well, yeah, and without going to a long song and dance on this either, presidential libraries are only official starting with Hoover. and the Presidential Libraries Act, and they're administered through the National Archives. So any presidential library prior to Herbert Hoover's is not really an official presidential library. It can call itself that, like Woodrow Wilson's presidential library in Stanton, where I'm from. And so the James Monroe Museum has never called itself a presidential library overtly. We sort of came close to it when we said Museum and Memorial Library, but it has actually been more confusing than helpful. And so we pretty much just say James Monroe Museum. Yeah. And yes, there was going to be a James Monroe Presidential Center years ago. The Board of Visitors of Mary Washington did authorize that, but circumstances changed, particularly the hope for federal funding that would have been behind that didn't occur. So didn't happen.
Well, Scott, I'm going to leave you with one, and the audience with one last question for you. So happens it comes from an old college classmate of mine who wants to know if you could speak a bit about Monroe's last days.
His last days. Monroe's decline after the presidency was relatively quick. He got out finally in 1820. Get my years right here. 5, and he suffered declining health. His wife and his son-in-law both died in 1830. And so he himself was in such declining state that by early in 1831, he was living in New York with his daughter and her husband. And he eventually succumbed on July 4th, 1831, the same day, of course, as Adams and Jefferson had 5 years earlier, and was buried in New York's Marble Cemetery. And then exhumed later, and his remains were taken to be one of the first burials, the first celebrity burial at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, and reinterred there in 1858 on the centennial of his birth. And I don't have it in front of me here, but there's a very poignant letter he wrote just a few weeks before he died to his old friend James Madison, kind of reviewing their life together and lamenting the fact that he realized they'd never see each other again. And he'd been fighting the federal government, trying to get reimbursed for expenses going back to his time in France, and having a lot of trouble with that. So there was finally a bill. He didn't die penniless, but he definitely had a hard time making the ends meet. So it was an unfortunate. It was a true decline, but at least he was with family when he died, and he did not get buried with his Masonic apron because it wasn't there when he was interred, and it never was. So that's why it's in the collection museum. But he had lived a long and fruitful and productive life in service of his country, and whatever disappointments he had, I think he lamented on them, but I think he also realized he had done the best that he could, and certainly had more jobs than anyone else who's ever been president, more public service roles. So it was a legacy to reflect on.
Scott, thanks so much for your lecture and for your perceptive answers to the questions. It was a pleasure to have you kick off our 2021 Great Live series. I appreciate all of you who have joined us.